I had a question about the nature of Christ and what it means to be fully human. Something I constantly think about and it gives me a little trouble is when we say Jesus was fully human, it seems to me that would sort of have to entail being a human person. And I know that anytime a human person is really mentioned in the context of the nature of Jesus, it's sort of just labeled as Nestorianism and tossed aside. But I was wondering if there's a possible view of a human person being encompassed by and united to a divine person so that they're not exactly separate, but they're united. I just think that, we're humans, we're persons. And when we say, well, Jesus took on flesh, it sort of sounds like, well, the divine person took on a body, but just taking on a body isn't what makes you a human. I mean, we lose our body when we die, but we're still human. We're still a person and so forth. And I also just think it sort of answers a lot of biblical questions about no one he doesn't know the day or the hour. He grows in wisdom. I think there's a verse that says that. Okay,
I'm a little confused. What church are you in that would say that Jesus? I don't understand where you're getting that's just tossed off as Nestorianism. The doctrine of the Hypostatic Union specifically says that Jesus is one person with two natures, and the Hypostatic Union emphasizes the reality of the full humanity of Christ. And Nestorius may not have been a Nestorian, but Nestorianism fundamentally divided divided Jesus into two persons in the sense of by denying the term Theotokos, and he was only the Christokos, the one who gave birth to the Christ, and not to the God-man. The real problem with that was the possibility of denying the hypostatic union. It sounds, I'm not sure if you're talking about Eutychianism, where you're talking about Apollinarianism, but point of the hypostatic union is that you have the divine nature and the human nature. They are not intermingled, so you have half God, half man. There is not a replacement of the spiritual or mental aspect of the human with the Logos, as you would have in Apollinarianism or in some forms of William Lane Craig's teachings. He calls it Neo-Apollinarianism. And then you don't have just simply a split between the two that could lead to adoptionism and other forms in Nestorianism. So it's a balanced recognition that the Son, the second person of the Trinity, takes on a full human nature, but it's a perfect human nature. It's not a fallen human nature. So I'm not sure where you're...
Well, and that's where I'm asking is when we say he took on a full human nature, how can you have a full human nature without being a human person? That's the thing. And I know there's...
I'm not sure what do you mean by human person? Because Jesus is a human person. I don't understand why you're saying that.
He's a human person and a divine person both.
Well, okay. So what you're saying is Jesus wasn't a human person. He was only a divine person?
No, I'm saying that maybe I've misunderstood the doctrine of the hypostatic union, but that's what is conveyed to me when we say that he's one person with two natures.
Well, that's because when you say one person, you're not denying either the divine nature or the human nature, but you are not making the human person a separate person so that there is some type of schizophrenic conversation going on between two different...
Well, okay, real quick. I appreciate that point. And that's why the Nestorian, the word separate is really important, because I wouldn't be saying that when I think about these issues that I would make them separate. I would make them united so that, it's more of like a unidirectional understanding that if you draw a circle and then a smaller circle inside, that the human person is encompassed by the divine person. So it's not like they'd be talking to each other. It's just that they're...
Well, but one is eternal and one is not. That's one thing to keep in mind. One is eternal, one is not. Jesus is clearly a human person in the sense that he is born, he grows, he increases in wisdom and stature before
and that's
God.
My main question is: was that person a created person in terms of the human nature of the aspect?
Of course, he couldn't have been eternal. There's no such thing as an eternal human being. The human nature that Jesus takes on.
The divine person didn't undergo a change.
That's right.
So
that's right.
Is it wrong to say that Jesus is two persons?
See, you're identifying the natures and taking that term nature and making it the same thing as person. We use the term person to speak to a totality, and you're using it to refer to natures. And that's what it would end up creating the division between divine and human. So I can say Jesus is a human person without turning Jesus into two persons, one divine person and one human person, as if those are complete categories that can be separated out from one another the way that we are. Jesus is absolutely unique. And so how that hypostatic union works to where he is one person with two natures doesn't mean that the divine nature was incomplete or the human nature was incomplete. It just means that they cannot be intermixed. As soon as you intermix them, like Eutyches did, then you no longer have a truly divine nature or a truly human nature. But when you say person, see, we use person of I'm trying to find a term, and this is the struggle that was had in the early church. The early church struggled because any human language we use is going to carry with it not only physicality, but limited categories of our own experience, and Jesus is absolutely unique. So that's where this problem is. That problem was exacerbated in the early church by the fact that this conversation took place once the Greek-Latin split had taken place. And so the West is using Latin, the East is using Greek, so you have to translate. And so hypostasis and ousia and persona and all these terms, and one early father will use it one way and another early father will use it another way, and that's where you end up with all very, very difficult issues and where a lot of the concern came from. But I think what might be helpful is just to keep in mind that Jesus has to be fully human to function as the God-man, so that his sacrifice is truly the giving of a human life. But Jesus cannot be two persons because then the one that gives himself is not the one who is speaking in John 17. There has to be a unity of voice, intention, and purpose for Jesus to be the God-man, but there has to be a recognition of the distinct natures without an intermixing. That's where when I went over that recently in the catechism questions we do as a part of our church services at Apologia, I introduced everybody to Nestorianism, Apollinarianism, Eutychianism, so that you sort of, if you put them on a graph, it would sort of like be the edges of a triangle. And if you know where the edges are, you can stay in the middle. And when you're talking about someone like Jesus, who's absolutely unique, same thing with the doctrine of the Trinity in regards to Godhead, we can say these things are not true, and so we can define the outer boundaries more easily than we can say this in the center is true, because on the outer boundaries we can say it's not like this, it's not like that. We can use analogy, and that's how we're comfortable as human beings to go. When we have to define the exact divine essence, when you have to define perichoresis, the interpenetration of the divine persons and the divine nature, when we have to describe the hypostatic union, we're talking about absolutely unique things that any type of analogy that we try to apply to it is going to end up leading us into error. So that's where the balance is to be found, and the balance is to be found in that Jesus has to be a true human person, not to the exclusion of the divine nature, but not in the sense of person as in separated out over here someplace, and then you can do the same thing with the divine person, and so they're just two different people that happen to be indwelling the same body. That's where you end up with a real problem. There is the hypostatic union is hypostasis and union. The union does not mean interpenetration, it does not mean mixture, but it's also a real union. And that's where the Nestorianism goes wrong. I'm not sure that Nestorius went wrong there, but that's where Nestorianism goes wrong, because the union is there without intermixture. That's where the balance has to be found, or the scriptural witness to who Jesus was falls apart. All right, Colin, thanks for your call.
Thanks, dude. I appreciate it.
All right, God bless.
Take care.
Bye-bye. dude. Definitely, dude. California call.